Hey everybody, this is Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com, and this is a quick overview of Express.js. Express.js is just a framework for creating back-end servers. So what I'm going to do today is to show you a quick setup of how you set up a Node.js project, how do you install Express, and kind of what Express does. Okay, don't mind the sirens in the background. I live in Brooklyn, which has lots of sounds. Okay, so I'm going to open up a new folder. And we're just going to call this test 9 since I've done 8 of these prior. Done a lot of videos on Express. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the terminal in this folder. Now generally when I start an Express project, the first thing I want to do is create a file called server.js. Okay, that's going to be where we do create our server from. And then from that file, or from that folder, I'm then going to want to run the command npm init-y. This tells Node that I want to create a new project, which is going to allow me to create a package.json, which is a file that tells Node everything about my project. And the -y just means accept all the defaults. So I do that, and see, there's my package.json file. And right now it doesn't really have anything special. So a few things I want to install are going to be npm I, which means npm install node package manager. Node package manager, I want to install Express. And that's actually all I want to install right now, because this is going to be a basic introduction. Cool. And I know it's installed because after I ran the install command, see, it magically appears here in dependencies. That's kind of the purpose of the package.json file, to keep track of the information needed for my project. Okay, and notice my start command already has the command I need to run the server.js file. So node server.js. Cool. So now let's open up the server.js now that we have Express installed. And whenever you're using Node, to bring in a library that you installed, you have to kind of do this, something like this. So I'm going to do const express. I'm making a variable called express. And I'm going to use this function called require. What require does is bring in things from other files. Now when I do this, Express is bringing it in. Since I didn't specify like a particular place where that file is, it assumes it's a library I installed. So it looks in this node modules folder that magically appeared when I installed Express, and it's going to look in there for a folder called Express and then bring that in there. So it takes what's inside that library and stores it in this variable. So now I have access to the Express library through this variable. The next thing I have to do is create an application object. The application object basically controls the entire application for Express. It keeps track of everything. So const app equals express as a function. And that creates this object called app that keeps track of everything. Cool. Now the simplest thing we can do is do app.listen. App.listen basically says when this function runs, start up, get the function or get this program to start listening for HTTP requests on a particular port. So I'm going to say, hey, let's listen for requests on port 3000. I think they go up to like 55,000 or something like that. So there's plenty of ports. Just don't use like the first couple thousand. And so listen for requests on that port. And afterwards, I can pass in a function that runs right after it begins listening. The reason you usually do this is just to have a little message that says console.log. I am listening on port 3000. This way we know we're listening. So let's test this out so far. So all we've done was we brought in Express, and we created a listener to listen to HTTP requests. Now I'm going to do node server.js, and see it says I am listening on port 3000. So let's test that out. Let's go back to my browser, and I'm going to go to localhost. Localhost is a pseudonym for your local computer. Okay, and we're going to go to localhost 3000. So we're sending a request. My browser is sending a request to my computer on port 3000. That's what that means. And see, it says cannot get. Why? Because there's nothing to get. in my program, I specified nothing. It's listening, but it doesn't know how to respond to anything. The whole point of a backend server is for when these requests come in, for us to design ways to respond to those requests. Right now I have no ways to respond to those requests. So the way you do that is you create what's called a route. And the simplest way to create a route is just to take our app object and then do dot the verb we're going to use. So in this case, browser, whenever you're like putting a URL in the browser, it's always a GET request. So I'm going to do app.get. So app.get slash, which means the root, because always the root URL is essentially, like, just to kind of give you my point, this is assumed, localhost 3000, since it's listening on localhost 3000. So it's asking what is the endpoint after that. So it's saying this endpoint, localhost 3000 slash. So localhost, that's Python, localhost 3000 slash. Then afterwards I have to say, when someone asks for that specific endpoint, how do we respond? So we create a function. And it always starts with rec res. Okay, to actually make it clear, we'll say request response. And these are just these two objects that Express always passes into your function that has all sorts of useful functions and tools and information for you to use. So the simplest thing I can do is just send a response. So I do response dot send, which means send a response, and I'm just going to send the string hello world. Okay, so I had killed my server with Control C, and now I'm going to restart my server by typing in the same command, node server.js, because the thing is that if I make changes, I have to reload the server for those changes to take hold. So now that I've made those changes, hello world. So I send a request, and the server responded with hello world. Okay, cool. Let me kill the server, Control C. That's pretty much what Express does, okay? The thing is, there's a lot more complex requests. So for example, we can do params. A URL param is done like this. Essentially, think of this as a variable, cheese. And what I can do is I can access that variable as part of my request object, because it gets sent over as part of the request. So in my request object, there's a variable called params. It's an object with all my URL params. So in my URL params, I've designated that it's going to be a cheese. So then I can go .cheese, which that variable is going to be anything after the slash. So let me start the server back up. Then go over here and then type in slash Gouda. And see it says Gouda. I change it to Munster. That's Munster. Because anything I put after the slash, because all it's doing is matching this to the URL you typed in. On top of that, you could do URL queries, which doesn't require me to specify a variable ahead of time. URL queries always look like this. I put a question mark at the end of the URL, then I type in some sort of key, so we'll just say cheese, and then here I'll say Gouda. Okay, and if I want to do another one, I can do and meat equals beef. Oh, equals beef. And I can add as many of these queries at the end of the URL as I want. Okay, that's the query. Now if I want to access that information, okay, here I'll just, let's replace it. Let's do this. We'll say, I'm going to create an object. I'm going to return an object. And inside that object is params, which params is going to equal request dot params and queries, so we can see it all on one screen. And that's going to be request dot query. So you'd be able to access all those properties like request dot query dot cheese, request dot query dot meat. I'm just going to send back the whole object so we can see it. Okay, So now if I go back here and I use this, I type in enter on this URL, see I get back this object with params and query, where in params, it's my URL param with Munster, and in the query we have cheese, Gouda, and meat, beef. Cool. Okay, and you can have a lot of fun with that. Cool. And that's kind of like the very, very basics. I just wanted to leave it at that, just so that way you guys get a flavor for what Express is doing. There's also something called middleware. Now, middleware are functions that run before it gets to the routes. So oftentimes there's middleware for all sorts of things, such as logging, which just means logging information into the terminal so that way you can diagnose problems. Usually people use a library called Morgan. There's request parsing. Okay, just depends what kind of information your application is taking in. Generally, if you're doing a multi-page application handling templates, you're taking information from forms. So if you're taking information from forms, that's called URL encoded data. But if you're building an API, APIs usually communicate via JSON, which are like JavaScript objects, JSON. So you would put in some sort of middleware here to parse that JSON that's coming in, to parse that URL encoded data from forms that's coming in. You would want to parse the right data. Theoretically, XML is always an option too, but no one really uses XML anymore for that. You'd also have middleware for what's called CORS. This is cross-origin resource sharing. So basically what happens is that your application may decide who can send requests. Cross-origin resource sharing will by default block other domains from making requests to your application unless you specify that they can. So you might have middleware for that. You might have middleware for authentication, handling logging in and making sure that people are still logged in. And usually authentication is done in two different ways. Either through a session, which means the server keeps track of who's already logged in, or through JOT tokens, JWT. And JOT tokens, they are tokens that get issued when you get logged in, and then you would submit them with the request, and that's how the server would know you're logged in. Either way. And then you might have middleware for what other middleware is useful. Yeah, I think that's all the main pieces of middleware you probably have. I'm not going to get through using middleware right now. You can watch some of my tutorials to see what kind of middleware I use, but just so you can see the kind of things you might put in there. You'd specify your requests and all your routes, and that's pretty much what Express does. And then you could also have middleware for like templating, which would be like EJS, embedded JavaScript, handlebars, Pug, Express React views. And these kind of allow you to create the website from the server side if you're not doing an API. Okay, you decided that you're going to create your page from the server side. So that's a brief overview of Express. My name's Alex Merced from alexmercedcoder.com. Have a great day and enjoy.